Today I'm going to be reading Racial Achievement Gap in the United States, a Wikipedia article about the racial achievement gap in the United States. Alright, here we go. The racial achievement gap in the United States refers to the educational disparities between various ethnic groups. It manifests itself in a variety of ways. Among students, blacks and Hispanics are more likely to receive lower grades, score lower on standardized tests, drop out of high school, and they are less likely to enter and complete college than whites, who similarly score way lower than Asians. The evidence, antecedents, implications, and successes of the achievement gap are discussed below. Over the past 45 years, students in the United States have made notable gains in academic achievement. However, the racial achievement gap remains because not all groups of students are advancing at the same rates. Evidence of the racial achievement gap has been manifested through standardized test scores, high school dropout rates, high school completion rates, college acceptance rates, and retention rates, as well as through longitudinal trends. While efforts to close the racial achievement gap have increased over the years with varying success, studies have shown that disparities still exist between achievement levels of minorities compared to white counterparts. Early schooling years, kindergarten through 5th grade. The racial achievement gap has been found to exist before students enter kindergarten for their first year of schooling. At the start of kindergarten, Hispanic and black students have math and reading scores substantially lower than those of white students. While both Hispanics and black scores have significantly lower test scores than their white counterparts, Hispanic and black have scores that are roughly equal to each other. In studies published in 2009, Reardon and Galando in 2009 specifically examined test scores by race and ethnicity. The data Reardon and Galino 2009 use comes from the ECLS-K, sponsored by the National Center of Education Statistics. The ECLSK contains data on a nationally representative sample of approximately 21,400 students from the kindergarten class of 1998 through 1999. The students in the sample were assessed in reading and mathematics skills 6 times from 1998 to 2004. The content areas of the test are based on the National Assessment of Educational Progress (NAEP). Fourth grade content areas adapted to be age appropriate at each grade level. The assessments were scored during a 3-parameter item response theory (IRT) model. Reardon and Galindo 2009 found that average Hispanic and black students began kindergarten with math scores 3/4 of a standard deviation lower than those of white students, and with reading scores a half standard deviation lower than those of white students. 6 years later, Hispanic-white gaps narrowed by roughly a third, whereas black-white gaps widened by about a third. More specifically, the white-Hispanic gap is a half-standard deviation in math and 3/8 in the reading at the end of the 5th grade. The trends in the Hispanic-white gaps are especially interesting because of the rapid narrowing that occurs between kindergarten and 1st grade. Specifically, the estimated math gap declines from 0.77 to 0.56 standard deviations, and the estimated reading gap from 0.52 to 0.29 in the roughly 18 months between the fall of kindergarten and the spring of 1st grade. In the 4 years from the spring of 1st grade through the spring of 5th grade, the Hispanic-white gaps narrow slightly to 0.50 standard deviations in math and widening slightly to 0.38 deviations in reading. 3rd through 8th grade. In a 2006 study published in the Review of Economics and Statistics, Colt-Felter, 2006, examines test scores of elementary and middle school students by race. The data used in the study comes from the administrative records created by North Carolina's Department of Public Instruction and maintained by the North Carolina Education Research Data Center and are not nationally representative. North Carolina requires all students to take standardized achievement tests in both math and reading at the end of every grade between grades 3 and 8. In order to make comparisons across the years, Colt-Felter, 2006, normalized the scale scores for each test in every year over all students in the state who took the test so that each test would have a mean score of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. On this normalized scale, positive scores denote above average performances relative to the statewide average. The negative scores denote a below average performance. Analysis by Goldfeller, 2006, found gaps between 4 different racial groups: white, Asians, Hispanics, and blacks. Essentially, while the black-white gaps are substantial, both Hispanic and Asian students tend to gain on whites as they progress on school. The white-black achievement gap in math scores is about half a standard deviation, and the white-black achievement gap in reading is a little less than half a standard deviation. By 5th grade, Hispanic and white students have roughly the same math and reading scores. By 8th grade, scores for Hispanic students in North Carolina surpassed those of observationally equivalent whites by roughly a tenth of the standard deviation. Asian students surpass whites on math and reading tests in all years except 3rd and 4th grade reading. In a 2006 study, Logrifo, Nicholas, and Reardon, 2006, found that starting in the 8th grades, I forgot to say secondary school, white students have an initial advantage in their reading achievements over blacks and Hispanic students, but not Asian students. Using nationality representative data from the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, ECLS-K, and the National Education Longitudinal Study, NELS:88, Logrifo, Nicholas, and Reardon, 2006, claim that black students score 5.49 points lower than white students, and Hispanic students score 4.83 points lower than white students on reading tests. These differences in initial status are compounded by differences in reading gains made during high school, specifically between 9th and 10th grades. While students gain slightly more than black students and Hispanic students, but white students gain less than Asian students between 10th and 12th grades. White students gain at a slightly faster rate than black students, but white students gain at a slower rate than Hispanic students and Asian students. In 8th grade, white students also have an initial advantage over black and Hispanic students in math tests. However, Asian students have an initial 2.71 point average over white students. I think my mom woke up. By the end of high school, gaps between groups increase slightly. Specifically, the 9-point advantage of white students over black students increases by about a point, and the initial advantage of Asian students over white students also increases by about a point. Essentially, by the end of high school, Asian students are beginning to learn intermediate-level math concepts, whereas black and Hispanic students are far behind, learning fractions and decimals, which are math concepts that the white and Asian students learn in the 8th grade. Black and Hispanic students in 12th grade with scores 11 and 7 points behind those of white students, while the male-female difference in math scores is only around 2 points. Standardized test scores. The racial group differences across admissions tests such as the SAT, ACT, GRE, GMAT, MCAT, LSAT, Advanced Placement Program examinations and others features uh, examinations and other measures of educational achievement have been fairly consistent. Since the 1960s, the population of students taking these assessments has been increasingly diverse. Consequently, the examination of ethnic score differences have been more rigorous, especially specifically the largest gaps exist between white and African American students. On average, they score about 0.82 to 1.18. Standard deviations lower than white students in composite test scores. Following closely behind is the gap between white and Hispanic students. Asian American students performance Asian American students' performance were comparable to those of white students, except Asian American students performed 1/4 standard deviation unit lower on the SAT verbal section and about 1/2 a standard deviation unit higher in the GRE quantitative test. The National Assessment of Education Progress reports that the national black-white gap and the Hispanic-white gap in math and reading assessments measured at the 4th and 8th grade level. The trends show both gaps widen in mathematics as students grow older, but tend to stay in the same reading. Furthermore, the NAEP measures the widening and narrowing of achievement gaps on the state level. From 2007 to 2009, the achievement gaps for the majority of states stayed the same, although the more fluctuations were seen at the 8th grade level than at the 4th grade level. The black-white gap demonstrates, in mathematics, a 26-point difference at the 4th grade level and a 31-point difference at the 8th grade level. In reading, a 27-point difference at the 4th grade level and a 26-point difference at the 8th grade level. The Hispanic-white gap demonstrates, in mathematics, a 21-point difference and at the 4th grade level and a 26-point difference at the 8th grade level. In reading, there is a 25-point difference at the 4th grade level and a 24-point difference at the 8th grade level in AEP 2011. The National Educational Longitudinal Survey, NELS 1988 demonstrates similar findings in their evaluation of assessments administered to 12th graders in reading and mathematics. Results of the mathematics achievement test. The quality is too crappy to read, but the white African American gap is about 20 points. Same thing with this one, and stays about. It's the biggest gap is at the lower grade levels and at the earlier ages, and it kind of narrows as it goes farther. Non-Hispanic white gaps, it narrows as well. It's like the same thing. High school dropout rates. According to the U.S. Department of Education, event dropout rate is the percentage of high school students who dropped out of high school between the beginning of one school year and the beginning of the next school year. 5 out of every 100 students enrolled in high school in October 2000 left school before October 2001 without successfully completing a high school program. The percentage of students who were event dropouts decreased from 1972 through 1987. However, despite some year-to-year fluctuations, the percentage of students dropping out of school each year has stayed relatively the same since 1987. Data from the 2001 Current Population Survey (CPS) shows that Black and Hispanic students were more likely to have dropped out of high school between October and October 2001 than were white or Asian/Pacific Islander students. During this period, 6.3% of Black and 8.8% of Hispanic high school students dropped out compared to 4.1% of white and 2.3% of Asian/Pacific Islander high school students. 2001 event dropout rates 16 to 24-year-olds by race. Event dropout rate. Asian/Pacific Islander, white, black, Hispanic. Event dropout rate 2.3 for Asian/Pacific Islander, 4.1 for white, 6.3 for black, 8.8 for Hispanic. According to the U.S. Department of Education, status dropout rates measure the percentage of individuals who are not enrolled in high school and who lack a high school credential, independent of when they dropped out. Status rates are higher than event rates because they include all dropouts in this age range, regardless of when they last attended school or whether or not they ever entered in the U.S. education system. In October 2001, about 3.8 million 16 through 24-year-olds were not enrolled in a high school program and had not completed high school. These individuals accounted for 10.7% of 35.2 million 16 through 24-year-olds in the United States in 2001. In 1972, the white status dropout rate was 40% and the black status dropout rate was 49%. Because the black rate declined more steeply than the white rate, there has been a narrowing of the gap between the dropout rates for blacks and whites. However, this narrowing occurred in the 1980s, and the gap between whites and blacks had remained fairly constant since 1990. The disproportionately represented among status dropouts in 2001. Also in 2001, the status dropout rate for Asian/Pacific Islanders ages 16 through 24 was lower than for any other 16 through 24-year-olds. Specifically, the status rate for Asian/Pacific Islanders was 3.6% compared to with 27.0% for Hispanics, 10.9% for blacks, and 7.3% for whites. 2001 status dropout rate 16 to 24-year-olds by race. Status dropout rate Asian/Pacific Islander 3.6%, white 7.3%, black 20.9%, Hispanic 27.0%. High school completion rates. Status completion rates measured the percentage of a given population at a high school credential, regardless of when the credential was earned. In 2001, 86.5% of the 18 to 24-year-olds not enrolled in elementary or secondary school had completed high school. Status completion rates increased from 82.8% in 1972 to 58.6% in 1990. Since 1991, the rate has shown no constant trend and has fluctuated between 84.8% and 86.5%. High school status completion rates for white and black young adults increased between the early 1970s and 1990, but has remained relatively the same since 1990. Specifically, status completion rates for white students increased from 86.0% in 1972 to 89.6% in 1990. Since 1990, white completion rates have remained in the range of 89.4 through 91.8%. In 2001, 91.0% of white and 85.6% of black 18 to 24-year-olds had completed high school. The percentage of black students completing high school rose from 26.1% in 1972 to 85.6% in 2001. The gap between black and white completion rates narrowed between 1972 and 2001. In 2001, 65.7% of all Hispanic 18 through 24-year-olds completed high school. This percentage compares to 91.0% of whites, 85.6% of blacks, and 96.1% of Asian/Pacific Islanders. Essentially, in 2001, whites and Asian-Pacific Islanders were more likely than their black and Hispanic peers to have completed high school. Also, white completed high school at a higher rate than both blacks and Hispanic students. Black students completed high school at a higher rate than Hispanics. 2001 status completion rates: 18 to 24-year-olds by race. Status completion rate: Asian/Pacific Islander 96.1, white 91.0, black 85.6, Hispanic 65.7%. The 4-year completion rate is the percentage of ninth grade students who left school over a subsequent 4-year period while also completing a high school credential. Data for the 4-year completion rate calculations are taken from the Common Core of Data (CCD). The 4-year completion rate calculation is dependent on the availability of dropout estimates over a 4-year span and the current counts of completers. Because dropout rate information was missing for many states during the 4-year period considered by the U.S. Department of Education, 4-year completion rate estimates for the 2000 through 01 school year are only available for 39 states. Since that data were not available from all states, an overall national rate could not be calculated. However, among the reporting states, the high school 4-year completion rate for public schools ranged from a high of 90.1% in North Dakota to a low of 65.0% in Louisiana. SAT scores. Racial and ethnic variations in SAT scores follows a similar pattern to the other racial achievement gaps. In 1990, the average SAT was 491 for whites, 528 for Asians, 385 for blacks, and 429 for Mexican Americans. 34% of Asians compared with 20% of whites, 3% of blacks, 7% of Mexican Americans, 9% of Native Americans scored above 600 on the SAT math section. On the SAT verbal section in 1990, whites scored an average of 442, compared with 410 with Asians, 352 for blacks, 380 for Mexican Americans, and 388 for Native Americans. 8% of whites, 10% of Asians, 2% of blacks, 3% of Mexican Americans, and 3% of Native Americans scored above 600 on the SAT verbal section in 1990. College enrollment and graduation rates. The U.S. Department of Education demonstrates performance of different ethnic groups in colleges and universities. Specifically, they found that about 72% of white students who have completed high school enrolled in college in the same year, compared to 44% for black students and 50% for Hispanic students. Furthermore, trends in undergraduate and graduate enrollment have shown increases in all ethnicity groups, but the largest gap still exists for black student enrollment. Hispanic and Asian Pacific Islander students enrollment have experienced the most growth since 1976. The 4-year national college graduation rate is 89% for white students, 51% for Hispanic students, 46% for black females, and 35% for black males. Furthermore, even at prestigious institutions, the graduation rate of white students is higher than that of black students. Long-term trends. The National Assessment of Educational Progress (NAEP) has been testing 17-year-olds since 1971. From 1971 to 1996, the black-white reading gap shrank by almost 1 year, half, and the math gap by almost 1/3. Specifically, blacks scored an average of 239 points, and whites scored an average of 291 points on the NAEP reading test in 1971. In 1990, blacks scored an average of 267, and whites scored an average of 297 points. On NAEP math test in 1973, blacks scored an average of 240, and whites scored 310. In 1990, black average score was 289, and whites scored an average of 310 points. For Hispanics, The average NAEP math score for 17-year-olds in 1973 was 277 and 310 for whites. In 1990, the average score among Hispanics was 284 compared to with 310 for whites. Because of small proportion size in the 1970s, similar trend data are not available for Asian Americans. Data from the 1990 NAEP mathematics assessment tests show that among 12th graders, Asians scored an average of 315 points compared with 300 points for whites, 270 points for blacks, 278 for Hispanics, and 290 for Native Americans. Racial and ethnic differentiation is most apparent at the highest achievement levels. Specifically, 13% of Asians performed at a level of 350 points or higher, 6% of whites, less than 1% of blacks, and 1% of Hispanics did so. The NAEP has since collected and analyzed data through 2008. Overall, the white Hispanic and the white black gaps for NAEP scores have significantly dropped since the 1970s. The black-white gap demonstrates, in mathematics, the gap for 17-year-olds was narrowed by 14 points from 1973 to 2008. In reading, the gap for 17-year-olds was narrowed by 24 points for 1971 to 2008. The Hispanic-white gap demonstrates, in mathematics, the gap for 17-year-olds was narrowed by 12 points from 1973 to 2008. In reading, the gap for 17-year-olds was narrowed by 15 points from 1975 to 2008. Furthermore, subgroups showed predominant gains in 4th grade at all achievement levels. In terms of achieving proficiency, gaps between subgroups in most states have narrowed across grade levels, yet had widened in 23% of instances. The progress made in elementary and middle schools was greater than that in high schools, which demonstrates the importance of early childhood education. Greater gains were seen in lower performing subgroups rather than in higher performing subgroups. Similarly, greater gains were seen in Latino and African American subgroups than for low income and Native American subgroups. So this is the gray lines represents reading at age 9. And the dark gray ones represent reading at age 13, and the black lines represent the reading level at age 17. So, all right. So for the white guys, the light gray was in the 210 range about, and for 13-year-olds was in the in the 260 range, and when they were 17, it was more in the almost in the 300 range. So I'd say 290. For the Hispanics, it's kind of less general. It's kind of more wonky, I guess. It's for ages 9, it was in the a little bit below 200. Age 13 was a little bit below 250, and for 17 just barely above 250, and approximately the same thing for blacks, but the 17-year-old scores are only a little bit better than the gray scores, and the light gray scores ages 9 are much lower. Theories about the origin of the racial achievement gap. The achievement gap between low-income minority students and middle-income white students has been a popular research topic among sociologists since the publication of the report Equality of Educational Opportunity, more widely known as the Coleman Report. This report was commissioned by the U.S. Department of Education in 1966 to investigate whether the performance of African American students was caused by their attending schools of a lesser quality than white students. Reported suggested that both in high school factors and home/community factors affect the academic achievement for students and contribute to the achievement gap that exists between races. The study of the achievement gap can be addressed from two standpoints: from a supply side and a demand side viewpoint of education. In poor economics, Banerjee and Duflo explained that the two families of arguments suggest surrounding education of underserved populations. Demand side arguments focus on aspects from minority problems that influence education achievement. These include family background and culture, which shape perceptions and expectations surrounding education. A large body of research has been dedicated to studying these factors contributing to the achievement gap. Supply side arguments focus on the provision of education and resources and the systemic structures in place that perpetuate the achievement gap. These include neighborhoods funding and policy. In 2006, Ladson Billings called on education researchers to move the spotlight of education research from family background to take into account the rest of the factors that affect educational achievement, as explained by the Coleman Report, in concept of opportunity gaps rather than achievement gaps, has changed the paradigm of educational research to assess education from a top-down approach. Demand side, family structure/parenting style. Children can differ in their readiness to learn before they enter school. Research has shown that parental involvement in a child's development has a significant effect on the educational achievement of minority children. According to sociologist Annette Leroux, differences in parenting styles can affect a child's future achievement. In her book Unequal Childhood, she argues that there are two main types of parenting: concerted cultivation and achievement of natural growth. Concerted cultivation is usually practiced by middle class parents, regardless of their race. These parents are more likely to be involved in their children's education and encourage the children's participation in extracurricular activities or sport teams, and to teach their children how to successfully communicate with authority figures. These communication skills give to children a form of social capital that helps them communicate their needs and negotiate with adults throughout their life. The achievement of natural growth is generally practiced by poor and working class families. These parents generally do not play as large a role in their child's education. Their children are less likely to participate in extracurriculars or sports teams, and they usually do not teach their children the communication skills that middle and upper class children have. Instead, these parents are more concerned that their children obey authority figures and have respect for authority, which are two characteristics that are important to have in order to succeed in working class jobs. The parenting practices that a child is raised with influences their future educational achievement. However, parenting styles are heavily influenced by the parents and family social, economic, and physical circumstances. In particular, immigration status, if applicable, education levels, incomes, and occupations influence the degree of parental involvement in their children's academic achievement. These factors directly determine the access of the parents to time and resources to dedicate to their children's development. These factors also indirectly indirectly determine the home environment and parents' educational expectations of their children. For example, children from poorer families have lower academic performance in kindergarten than children from middle to upper class backgrounds, but children from poor families who have cognitively stimulating materials in the home have demonstrated higher rates of academic achievement in kindergarten. Additionally, parents of children living in poverty are less likely to have cognitively stimulating materials in the home for their children and are less likely to be involved in their child's school. In the United States, most minority groups are more likely to live in poverty than white Americans. Unemployment rate and mortgages for African and Latina Americans are usually higher than white Americans, and although Asian Americans families earn on average more income than white American families do, there are usually more family members working in the Asian American family than the white American family. These disparities in socioeconomic status between minority groups and white Americans help explain differences in parenting styles, family structure, and the resultant educational achievement of the minority children. However, the racial gaps persist when comparing families with similar income. Whites from families with incomes below 10,000 had a mean SAT test score that was 61 points higher than blacks whose families had incomes of between $80,000 and $100,000. Oh God. Where was I? In African American family structure in 2011, 72% of black babies were born to unwed mothers. There is a consensus in the literature about the negative consequences of growing up in single parent homes on educational attainment and success. Children growing up in single home parents are more likely to not finish school and generally obtain less years of schooling than those in two parent homes. Specifically, boys growing in homes with only their mothers are more likely to receive poor grades and display behavioral problems. For black high school students, the African American structure does affect their educational goals and expectations also. Studies on the topic have indicated that children growing up in single parent homes face disturbances in young childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood as well. Although these effects are sometimes minimal and contradictory, it is generally agreed that the family structure a child grows up in is important for their success in the educational sphere. Cultural differences. Some experts believe that cultural factors contribute to the racial achievement gap. Students from minority cultures face language barriers, differences in cultural norms and interactions, learning styles, varying levels of receptiveness of their culture to white American culture, and varying levels of acceptance of the white American culture by the students. In particular, it has been found that the minority students from cultures with views that generally do not align with mainstream cultural views have a harder time at school. Furthermore, views of the value education differ by minority groups as well as members within each group. Both Hispanic and African American youths often receive mixed messages about the importance of education and often end up performing below their academic potential. Latino American. Many Hispanic Americans who immigrate to the United States see a high school diploma as a sufficient amount of schooling and may not stress the importance of continuing on to college. Parental discouragement from pursuing higher education tends to be based on the notation of "you made it without formal schooling, so you can too." Additionally, depending on the immigration generation and economic status of the student, some students prioritize their obligations to assisting their family over the educational aspirations. Poor economic circumstances have placed greater pressure on the students to sacrifice time spent working towards educational attainment in order to dedicate more time to help support the family. Blah 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 blah. They also this message. Overall, Latino students face barriers such as financial stability and insufficient support for higher education within their families. Reading to children when they're younger increases literacy comprehension, which is a fundamental concept in the education system. However, it's less likely to occur with Latino American families because many parents do not have any formal education. Currently, Latino Americans over the age of 25 have the lower percentage in obtaining a bachelor's degree or higher amongst all other racial groups, while only having a level of 11%. African American students are also likely to receive different message about the importance of education from their peer groups and their parents. Many young African Americans are told by their parents to concentrate on school and do well academically, which is similar to the message that many middle class white students receive. However, the peers of African American students are more likely to place less emphasis on education, sometimes accusing studious African American students of acting white. This causes problems for black students who want to pursue higher levels of education, forcing some to hide their study or homework habits from their peers and perform below their academic potential. Asian American students are more likely to view educational as a means to social mobility, as they believe it performs a means to overcome language barriers as well as discrimination. This notation comes from the parental expectations of the children, which are rooted in the cultural belief that hard work is the key to educational and eventually occupational attainment. Many Americans immigrated to the United States voluntarily in search for better opportunities. This immigration status comes into play when asserting cultural views of Asian Americans and attitudes of more recent immigration are associated with optimistic views about the correlation between hard work and success. Obstacles such as language barriers and acceptance of white American culture are more easily overcome by the voluntary immigrants since their expectations of attaining better opportunities in the United States influence their interactions and experiences. Supply side. Geographic and neighborhood factors. The quality of school that a student attends and the socio-economic status of the student's residential neighborhood are two factors that can affect a student's academic performance. In the United States, the financing of most public schools is based on local property taxes. This system means that schools located in areas with lower real estate values have proportionally less money to spend per pupil than schools located in areas with higher real estate values. The system has also maintained a funding segregation because minority students are much more likely to live in a neighborhood with lower property values. They are much more likely to attend a school that receives significantly lower funding. Using property taxes, lower funded schools are more likely to have one, lower paid teachers, two, higher student teacher ratios, meaning less individual attention for each student, three, older books for fewer extracurricular activities have been shown to increase academic achievement. Five, poorly maintained school buildings and grounds, and six, less access to the service like school nursing and social workers. All of these factors can affect student performance and perpetuate inequalities between students of different races. Living in high poverty or disadvantaged neighborhoods have been shown to negatively influence the educational aspirations that consequently attain it. The moving to opportunity experiments that moving to a low poverty neighborhood has a positive effect on the educational attainment of minority adolescents. Additionally, living in a neighborhood with economic and social inequalities leads to negative attitudes and more problematic behavior due to social tensions. Greater college aspirations have been correlated with more social cohesiveness among neighborhood youth, since community support from both youth and adults in the neighborhood tends to have a positive influence on educational aspirations. Racial and ethnic residential segregation in the United States still persists, with African Americans experiencing the highest degree of residential segregation, followed by Latino Americans and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Its isolation from white American communities is highly correlated with low property values and high poverty. Neighborhoods associated with home ownership by minority groups is further undetermined by institutionalized discriminatory practices such as differential treatment of African Americans and Latino Americans in the house market compared with white Americans. High mortgages charged to African American or Latino American buyers make it more difficult for members of these minority groups to attain full home ownership in a community like wealth. As a result, African American and Latino American groups continue to live in a racially segregated neighborhood and face the socio-economic consequences of residential segregation. Differences in the academic performance of African American and white students exist even in schools that are desegregated and diverse. And studies have shown that school racial mix does not have much effect on changes in reading scores after sixth grade or on math scores at any age. In fact, minority students in segregated minority schools have more optimism and greater educational aspirations as well as achievements than minority students in segregated white schools. This can be attributed to various factors, including the attitudes of faculty and staff at segregated white schools and the effect of stereotype there. Alright. No, is this almost over? Jesus Christ, no it isn't. Okay. Where am I? Alright. Legacy of discrimination argument. An argument has been put in that disciplinary disparity in income that exists between African Americans and whites directly contributes to the racial achievement gap. The school of thought argues that the origin of this wealth gap is slavery and racism that made it extremely difficult for African Americans to accumulate wealth for almost 100 years. A comparable history of discrimination created a similar gap between Hispanic and whites. The results in many minority children being born into low socioeconomic backgrounds, which in turn affects educational opportunities. Research has shown that time and time again that the wealth and income of parents is a primary factor influencing student achievement. A low socioeconomic background can have negative effects on a child's educational achievement before even starting school. Indeed, research has shown that achievement gap is present between races before starting formal education. On average, when entering kindergarten, African American students are 1 year behind white students in terms of vocabulary and basic math skills, and this can continue to grow as the child education continues. Part of the racial achievement gap can be attributed to the experience of the refugee population in the United States. Refugee groups in particular face obstacles such as cultural and language barriers and discrimination, in addition to pre-migration stresses. These factors affect how successfully refugee children can assimilate to end success and succeed in the United States. Furthermore, it has been shown that immigrant children from politically unstable countries do not perform as well as immigrant children from politically stable countries. Genetic difference. Philip Rushton and Arthur Jensen suggest that the results of intelligence testing determines that genetic differences can explain some or all of the racial achievement gap in American education. Research has demonstrated that African Americans' average brain sizes are about 6.3% smaller than whites and 7.7% smaller than Asians. Oh, my toe popped. Studies have also shown that blacks adopted at birth but raised by middle-class white American parents are, on average, had adult IQ scores 18% lower than whites and Asians raised by white parents. Robert Sternberg later published a reply to Rushton and Jensen in which he wrote critically of their approach to the subject and of some of their specific claims and rhetoric. Sternberg states that his belief that science should be conducted with values in mind. He then argues that Rushton and Jensen were wrong to suggest any policy implications of the research because international variations, social norms, and definitions of success may affect the influence IQ has on the attainment of success. While Sternberg acknowledges that there is a genetic factor affecting individual intelligence, he asserts that intelligence is changeable and at the group level subjective. The racial achievement gap has consequences on the life outcomes of minority students. However, this gap has the potential for negative implications for American society as a whole, especially in terms of workforce quality and the competitiveness of the American economy. As the economy has become more globalized and the United States economy has shifted away from manufacturing and towards a knowledge-based economy, education has become an incredibly important determinant of economic success and prosperity. A strong education is now essential for preparing and training the future workforce that is able to compete in the global economy. Education is also important for attaining jobs and a stable career, which is critical for breaking the cycle of poverty and securing a sound economic future, both individually and as a nation. Students with lower achievement are more likely to drop out of high school, entering the workforce with minimal training and skills, and subsequently earning substantially less than those with more education, therefore limiting the racial achievement gap and improving the achievement of minority students will help eliminate economic disparities and ensure that America's future workforce is well prepared to be productive and competitive citizens. um, Reducing the racial achievement gap is especially important because the United States is becoming an increasingly diverse country. The percentage of American and Hispanic students in school is increasing. In 1970, African Americans and Hispanics made up to 50% of the school age population, and that number has increased to 30% by 2000. It's expected that minority students will represent the majority of school enrollments by 2015. Minorities make up a growing share of America's future workforce. Therefore, the United States' economic competitiveness depends heavily on closing the racial achievement gap. And then basically it just goes on to say that the amount of money that it's spent on school and stuff for them. And I'll just skip to this end part because that's a lot of words. 3.7 billion would be saved on community college remediation costs and lost earnings if all high school students were ready for college. Furthermore, if high school graduation rates for males increased by 5%, cutting back on crime spending and increasing earnings each year would lead up to an 8 billion increase in the U.S. economy. Job opportunities. As the United States economy has moved towards a globalized knowledge-based economy, education has become even more important for attaining jobs and a stable career, which is critical for breaking the cycle of poverty and securing a sound economic future. The racial achievement gap can hinder job attainment and social mobility for minority students. The United States Census Bureau reported 62,545 as the median income of white families, 38,409 of black families, and 39,730 for Hispanic students. And while the median income of the of Asian families is $75,027, the number of people working in these households is usually greater than that of the white American families. This differences in income levels relate highly to educational opportunities between various groups. Students who drop out of high school as a result of the racial achievement gap demonstrate difficulty on the job market. The median income of young adults do not finish high school is 21,000 compared to 30,000 of those who have at least earned a high school credential. This translates into a $630,000 in difference in the course of a lifetime. Students who are not accepted or decide not to attend college as a result of racial achievement may forgo over $450,000 in a lifetime earnings had they earned a bachelor or of arts degree. In 2009, $36,000 was the median income for those with an associate degree, was $45,000 for those with a bachelor's degree, and $60,000 for a master's degree or higher. Stereotype threat is just talking about stereotypes and stuff, so yeah, and how it pushes them to score differently on the tests, and it makes so basically blacks and whites have basically identical SAT scores when there's no stereotype threat, but they perform slightly worse with a stereotype threat, which is just slightly. So this isn't really that important, so I thought I wouldn't really touch up on it that much. So, and then political representation is just about, yeah, they um okay, since median income per capita for minority groups is lower than that of white Americans, and since minority groups are more likely to occupy less gainful employment and achieve lower education levels, there is a lower likelihood of political participation among minority groups. Education attainment has been proven to dictate income and occupation, and there's a proven disparity between educational attainment of white Americans and minority groups, with only 30% of bachelor's degrees awarded in 2009 to minority groups. Thus, socioeconomic status and therefore political participation is correlated with race. Research has shown that African Americans, Latino Americans, and Asian Americans are less politically active by varying degrees than white African Americans. Consequences of underrepresentation of minority groups in leadership is incongruence between policy and community needs. Blah 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 showed 82% of the largest urban school districts, and it shows that passive and active representation of minority groups serves to align constitution, policy preference, and presentation of these opinions, and thereby facilitate political empowerment of these groups. Achievement gaps among students may also manifest themselves in the racial and ethnic composition of special education and gifted education programs. Typically, African American and Hispanic students are enrolled in greater numbers in special education programs than their numbers would indicate in most populations. While these groups are underrepresented in gifted programs, research shows that these disproportionate enrollment may be consequence of the differences in educational achievement among groups. Efforts to narrow the achievement gap. The United States tried a variety of different attempts to narrow the racial achievement gap. This includes focusing on the importance of early childhood, using federal standards-based reforms, and implementing institutional changes. Basically, the early educational childhood education stuff shows that 8 psychologists performed experiments on infant child born in Quebec in 1997 and 1998, and followed the experiment followed annually until they were 7, and they found that the the learning in the lower years, or like the earlier years of childhood, the lower years of childhood was very important compared to the later years of childhood. So yeah, that's basically that kind of smushed together. Standard-based reforms. How much longer is this? All right. Okay. Sorry about that. I got freaked out. My house is dark. Research has shown that making certain changes in schools can improve the performance of minority students. These include lowering class size in schools with large population of minority students, explaining access to high quality preschool programs to minority families, and focusing on teaching the critical thinking and problem solving skills that are necessary to retain high level information. Charter schools. So charter schools is just showing the higher up schools basically, and they how they take our alternative uh, approaches to teaching that help the kids learn and um, helps them helps it just basically helps them get better jobs in the future and have better lives altogether. Oh no, non-English schools. I don't know how to read it. Okay. To evade a shift to English, some Native American tribes have initiated language immersion schools for children where Native Indian language is the medium for instruction. For example, the Cherokee Nation instigated a 10-year language preservation plan that involved growing new fluent speakers of the Cherokee language from childhood on up through school immersion programs, as well as a collaborative community effort to continue to use the language at home. This plan was part of an ambitious goal that in 50 years, 80% more of the Cherokee people will be fluent in the language. Cherokee Preservation Foundation has invested $3 million into opening schools, training teachers, and developing curricula for language education, as well as initiating community gatherings where the language can be actively used. Formed in 2006, the Kituwa Preservation and Education Program (KPEP) on the Koala boundary focuses on language immersion programs for children from birth to fifth grade, developing cultural resources for the general public and community language programs to foster the Cherokee language among adults. The non-English schools showed a 80. Okay, they showed 11% of proficiency in math, 25% in reading, 31% of graders earned proficiency in math, 87 in reading, and 50% in eighth graders in math, and 78 in reading. So the non-English schools helps the students have much more proficient um, uh, rates on the proficiency levels. Private schools. Oh, that's nice. Okay. Blah 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 blah. Private schools. I'm just gonna read the table. NAEP test subject reading 2002, 2002, 2001. Alright, so reading, 4th year grade gap 29, 12th year grade gap 25, negative 13.8, and all of these are for public. For private, it's 27.14 and then negative 48.1, which is much better. Same thing for math, it just goes ahead and it's basically school is public school. And then it just goes to talk about how it does that, which is helping them prepare for college more. So yeah. Teach for America TFA recruits and selects graduates from some of the top colleges and universities across the country to teach in the nation's most challenging K through 12 schools throughout the nation. It began in 1990 with 500 teachers and has since expanded to over 4,000 teachers placement in 2010. In the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, they use individual level student data linked to teacher data in North Carolina to estimate the effects of having a TFA teacher compared to a traditional teacher. According to studies about the effect of different teacher preparation programs in Louisiana, North Carolina, and Tennessee, TFA is among the most effective sources of new teachers in low-income communities. Each of these statewide studies, conducted between 2009 and 2012, found that course members often help their students achieve academic gains at rates equal to or larger than those of students of more veteran teachers. The findings show that TFA teachers are, in general, more effective, according to student exam scores, than traditional teachers that would be in the classroom in their stead. Would be in their stead. That's not proper grammar. They need to fix that. These estimates demonstrate that, compared with traditional teachers with similar levels of experience, TFA teachers have strong positive effects on student test scores, and despite the limitations of TFA teachers, they are no worse than average traditional teachers in teaching math subjects and much more effective in teaching science subjects. Although TFA teachers tend to have stronger academic credentials, they have not been taught in traditional training programs, are more likely to teach for a few years, and are assigned to some of the most challenging schools in the country. Given these differences, the TFA program has been controversial. So critics of Teach for America point out two of the major problems. The first is that most TFA teachers have not received traditional teacher training. TFA course members participate in an intensive 5-week summer national institute and 2-week local orientation and induction program prior to the first teacher teaching assignment, and therefore some argue they are not as prepared for the demands of the classroom as traditionally trained teachers. The second criticism is that TFA requires only a 2-year teaching commitment, and the majority of course members leave at the end of that commitment. The short tenure of TFA teachers is troubling because research shows that new teachers are generally less effective than more experienced teachers. And then all these other see alsos. If you want to read those, you can. And here's all of the sites, references, and stuff. If you guys want to look at this, you guys should definitely check it out. I'll see ya.